episode 141 of the RUDIS Wrestling Podcast. The college wrestling season, as we know, is over. But at this time of year, Matt, this is when the dust is settled. We've awarded the Hodge, and we get into these best of list seasons and things of that nature. And one topic that has never really been comfortable with me, and I want to revisit it here today. We're going to start the series on this. Goes back to 2005. In that year, the NCAA, working with the Hall of Fame and a number of other wrestling organizations and wrestling experts, came up with the 75th anniversary team. This was presented outside at Union Station in St. Louis in conjunction with the Division I Championships. And this was a big deal. There's a big poster made of it. I've actually got the poster somewhere in this archive that is my speakeasy. But there were 15 members of the team. And Matt, what do you remember about this team and how it was announced?
Well, I remember I was coaching that weekend at the tournament, so I saw things leading up, the promotion of it, the fan polls and different things. But being in the event, I was kind of locked in coaching mode. I wasn't out and about around the fan fest, so I saw the outcome of the results and found it interesting, just from a cursory standpoint. But I wasn't in the weeds following this or anything like that.
Well, what's interesting is here's the verbiage from the actual release that came out, written by Mark Beddix, who those of you know with the NCAA, or those that don't know, Mark was a really good guy with the NCAA, did a lot of work for the championships and the NCAA as a whole. But it said a panel of collegiate wrestling experts compiled a list of 45 former wrestlers in 3 divisions, lightweight, middleweight, and heavyweight, to be nominated for the 75th anniversary team. Here's the fun part. Fans from across the nation then voted online, and the top 5 vote getters in each category were named to the 15-member team. So we had a fan vote determine this. Now, 2005, a lot of people were online. I know when I had just finished up with college, we had high-speed internet at the house, but the amount of people we have online now and the immediacy, like with these Twitter polls that we've seen, these schools are doing virtual brackets. Ohio State just did a virtual bracket. Johnson and Wales, I think, is in the middle of a virtual bracket right now, and you're voting on Twitter. Richard Immel from Track Wrestling did a virtual bracket of the greatest all-time college wrestler, which I think, Cael Sanderson beat Kyle Dake in the finals on the fan vote. But I'm looking back 15 years, and our information, while there were sites like Wrestling Stats and the late Jay Hammond had put those together, we were still in a situation where this fan vote really kind of gave it to the old timers, but you could also see where the big fans were online, like the University of Iowa, for example. I know in my podcast history here, I put almost over 2,000 podcasts out, or over 2,000. If there's anything about the University of Iowa, the numbers go up. Same with Penn State now. Anything with Penn State, the numbers go up. So those fan bases really drive metrics in a lot of different ways. So this team was decided. And again, those 3 categories. So here's who made the team. And what we're going to do on the next couple episodes, obviously we have interviews with Chris Pendleton, which I just finished up with. Scotty Sentis is also going to be on the show talking with the new head coaches. But we're going to discuss these weight classes, and we're not going to go through all 15 on one show and argue them. We're going to go light, middle, and heavy. And then we're going to come back, as we teased last episode that Matt and I were on. We're going to look at maybe what's going to happen now if there's a 90th anniversary team. And then, RUDIS Wrestling Podcast, we're still plugging away when we get to 100 years. Oh, we're going to have a field day with that, because I'm probably going to be a little grayer and have a lot less hair, but I'm still going to be just as adamant about certain people making this team. So that being said, here are the lightweights: Yo-Yo Utaki, Dan Gable, Stephen Abbas, Tom Brands, John Smith. The middleweights: Lee Kemp, Lincoln McElravy, Wade Chalice, Pat Smith, and Joe Williams. The upperweights: Kurt Angle, Ed Bannock, Carlton Hasselrig, Dan Hodge, and Cael Sanderson. If you look at it strictly on the name recognition, Matt, that looks like just a dynamite 15. I mean, it's stellar.
Yeah, I mean, you look top to bottom 1 through 15, and on the surface you can't argue with it. But I think when you open it up and you determine a 75th anniversary team determined by fans, there's you open yourself up to subjectivity there, right? Like
and clearly our discussion on this is also going to be wholly subjective. I am not going to hide I'm not, there's a certain, you're going to figure out who I'm really pushing for here early in the lightweight discussion, but this is fans talking about it, and we're going to put the fan hat on and we're going to talk about it and look at it. But again, this whole argument, this whole discussion everywhere, this is also what's great about wrestling discussions, is a subjective nature. Now, we're going to try to put some stats to it and validate our opinions based on these stats. But yes, again, full disclaimer, this is subjective, and I'm about to commit wrestling heresy. Just giving you four.
Right. And this is what's fun about it. Obviously, the list compiled and posted for the last 15 years, everybody's looked to it as like that's the 75th anniversary team, but it truly was a fan-driven vote. And so it wasn't a committee that's breaking down stats or establishing a set criteria, because that was my first thought when it came out and we started discussing this. I'm like, well, JB, what was the criteria? Like, did they establish or provide weight to categories like a national title carries this amount of weight, or is there a metric that drives the number? But it was truly, this shouldn't be taken that seriously. It's just, there's an element of, hey, for me, there's guys on this, like, I just like this guy. There was an appeal to the way he wrestled and a flair to his style or whatever that I just gravitated to. Or maybe there was another university where I'm not as big a fan of. So even though I know this guy has a credential, the credentials of whatever 3-time NCAA champ, I'm going to rationalize in my mind why my guy was better than that guy. And yeah, you can't get so bound by convention. Like, oh, you said this is your opinion. It's just opinions here. Right.
Okay. And all that being said, one of the writers from the Iowa State Daily, this is kind of in that line, had sent me some questions about the virtual NCAAs that some fan had run. And there's also the coin flip nationals, and track had the quant wrestling simulation, and then WrestleStat. I think iWrestle was working with them on simulation. So we had like 4 different like simulated or make-believe tournaments for the Division I championships. And the irateness, wrestling Twitter exploded over these fake results. And it's so funny to see how passionate some fans can be. Like, no, that would never happen. No, like upsets never happen at the national championships. So I'm expecting a little bit of that. Be like, yo, you're crazy. Well, yeah, I've been called crazy before. So just again, throwing all of those, throwing that all out there before we even start. Now, the first thing I was asking, I guess, to the point was how do we look at each particular weight class? So again, 115 to 141 is the weight determination for what is considered lightweight, according to this panel of experts, which I was not actually a part of 15 years ago when this list came out. I had actually just started working for the NWCA and Intermat that year. And, one of the cool things was, I got to interview Kurt Angle, which at the time kind of marking out for a guy that was one of my wrestling heroes. Yeah, that's kind of cool. That notwithstanding, we look at it was 15 wrestlers per weight class category. Now, of the 5 that we mentioned, Utaki, Gable, Abbas, Tom Brands, and John Smith, here is the rest of the pool that was considered for the fan vote. Dave Auble of Cornell, Mike Caruso of Lehigh, Dwayne Keller of Oklahoma State, Randy Lewis from Iowa, Gene Mills from Syracuse, Rex Peary from Oklahoma State, Ed Peary from Pitt, Myron Roderick from Oklahoma State, and Rick Sanders from Portland State. So those are the other ones that were added. Not included on the list is one Elliot Gray Simons from Lock Haven. I will get to that later. So as stands from just championship, now we're not taking Olympics into consideration. This is strictly a college, and that is really hard to separate when we get to John Smith, because You're talking about 6 World Olympic titles, but also Yutaki represented Japan at the Olympics. We've got Gable with a world championship and an Olympic championship. We've got Stephen Abbas with an Olympic medal. We got Tom Brands with Olympic medals. We got all 5 of these guys have represented their country at the Olympic Games. So of the 5, Yutaki, Gable, Abbas, Brands, and Smith, here's how I rated them based on their college credentials. This is real. Again, this is the thing. You got to almost remove this. And Matt, I know you're going to have a problem with this. You even said so. I ranked them Yutaki, Gable, Abbas, Brands, Smith in terms of their college credentials. So that's where we start. That's where I start. Where do you start here?
Well, for me, and this is when it comes, I'm going to introduce my bias right now. John Smith, to me, was my favorite wrestler ever. And it's hard for me when I look at his career. I'm gonna do my best, JB, but it will be hard to separate his freestyle career, given the fact that he did win a world and Olympic title, the world title right after his college career, but the Olympic title during his career. So it's really going it's going to be hard for me to separate, number one, because he did achieve 2 of his 6 world titles during his collegiate career, which is, I know it is. It's hard to separate. And let's do that. Let's establish this right now. This is strictly on collegiate performance, right?
Right.
Only. Okay. So
now we can throw that in there, because there's certain stuff. Well, he did this later on. Yeah. And there are distinguished members of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And to be a distinguished member, you have to not only exceed, expectation or, perform extremely well in college. You also have to have either some coaching background or some international accolades to go with it. That's for the distinguished member. Very few distinguished members in the Hall of Fame only have some college credentials with them. I mean, just off the top of my head, I think 90% of them have some type of Olympic or international chunk of reputation there. So while it's, again, not factoring in how I'm going to argue this point, but it's notable, and that can't be ignored in terms of the discussion point. But from then again, it's subjective. We're kind of making our own rules as we go. It's like, whose line is it anyway? Where, the points are made up. But anyway, so you've got, we've got John Smith, your favorite. And, growing up in an era where I didn't discover wrestling until late, I didn't get a chance to see John wrestle like on TV. I mean, it was, my first Olympics that I remember watching was in 96. Even though I knew it was around, I wasn't a wrestling person until 96. So from this weight class, I don't have anybody swaying my vote there.
Yeah, I guess the thing for me that my bias is introduced. John was the athlete that I looked to, and so many athletes of my era looked to John and emulated his style and emulated his wrestling. We were only able to do that because we were getting better access to the sport of wrestling. And it's laughable when you're talking about, in my era, the 90s, having access to wrestling as opposed to what athletes have available to them in 2020. It just pales in comparison. But I remember all those things, seeing the Goodwill Games, seeing the World Championships, seeing the Olympic Games. So that influenced me. That being said, I've always been a guy, when it talks about greatness, and we're talking about greatness on the collegiate level, my first criteria is titles. Like that's almost the beginning and the end of where my thought is. Like, okay, 3 overtakes 2 overtakes 1 overtakes 0. And so when I look at these, you can make a strict decision based on titles with these 5 athletes, right? And you can rack them.
Yes. But we have the caveat that Utaki and Gable both competed in an era where freshmen were ineligible. The freshmen didn't become eligible until 1968. Right. So, and this is one historical discussion that's kind of a tangential to it. Where do we determine current era? I think a lot of people determine, like, Gable kind of gave wrestling that next umph. The modern era of wrestling starts with Dan Gable. So in my estimation, it kind of starts in Gable's freshman eligibility is essentially where I determine it. So from that era on, where we have the 4-time All-American potential, save 1947, which is the only year freshmen were eligible, again, coming off of World War II in that second season. With the 5 freshman champs that year in 47, many of which were 22, 23 years old. So there's the some of them you can break out to the pre-World War II era, and then from 46 through 67 could be another era. But I consider the modern era 68 on, when you have the 4-time champions, the 4-time placement. And we've got Utaki and Gable, who are, at best, they had 3 shots at it. And Utaki never lost a college match, and ineligible as a freshman, then won. So I'm actually not 100% sure when he came over, whether he did come over during that freshman year. It's one of those things that he's not really around American wrestling circles, if at all, anymore. But he was 1-1-1 and undefeated for Oklahoma State. This man was so badass, they changed the wrestling rules because of him. Takedowns went to just the first takedown was 2 points. I mean, to be that good that you change college wrestling rules or are one of the catalysts. I don't think there's any type of argument against Utaki being on this list ever.
No, I mean, just based on that fact alone, he's my number 1 guy on the list. If we had to rank who's the top guys, he's my number 1 guy. Came in, no freshman eligibility, won 3 straight, undefeated, and you literally changed the name of the game. That carries weight in my book. You fundamentally alter, they rewrite the rule book because of you. That speaks to your level of domination. There's one thing to have titles, but it's another thing to have the bragging rights like, oh no, I literally changed the rules of wrestling. And so when you break down the eras of wrestling, now for me, and knowing like how most athletes navigate their way to the national championship, typically most guys need an opportunity to compete that freshman year to get an understanding of the tournament. And then once you have that knowledge base in hand, that experience, okay, this is how I navigate this tournament. They have the confidence to go in that second year and like, no, I know what this tournament is about. I'm going to go win it. So I think there's something to be said when you look at a guy like Tom Brands. What did he learn? He was 4th his freshman year, but just having the opportunity to compete as a freshman, I think really positioned him to win the next 3 straight, where Gable and Utaki didn't have that advantage. And to that point, to add credence to that point, there's a reason we only have 4 4-timers, because it's a very difficult thing to come in as a true freshman and win it. So I think there's a benefit when we see a guy like Brands, and I'm not trying to discredit his 3 titles because they stand by themselves, but there is a benefit that he had over Utaki and Gable by being able to compete as a freshman. So in that situation, that's why I would put those guys. One of the guys, if we're looking my favorite guy, I may bump off the list based upon those things, but I definitely think it does position Utaki and Gable towards the forefront of the list.
Well, and we look at what's going on. So we got Utaki as a 3-timer in this group. Then Abbas and Brands are both 4-1-1-1. They're both 4th as a freshman, then 3 titles. So those are the 2. And just, well, why don't you have the 3-timers ahead of the 2-timers? Well, Gable, again, is probably the greatest 2-time national champ to ever live because he was ineligible as a freshman, was undefeated that year, did win the Midlands, did beat a national champion or a runner-up. I'm not sure, I can't remember off the top of my head who he beat. Obviously, I wasn't alive. It's a history lesson here. But again, you know, the historic loss, the legendary loss to Larry Owings in the finals. And Owings never won another title, which is interesting to bring up because he ended up being a 3-time All-American, never won another title. But then Abbas, who had 4 career college losses, 3 of which coming his freshman year, and then the other was his sophomore year, up a weight to Eric Guerrero, who would end up being a 3-time national champion. So now when we get to this is where we get into the minutia, where we're arguing the better losses. Tom Brands had 7 career losses, and I've been able to track down 5 of them from Kyle Klingman. We know his freshman year at the tournament lost to Kendall Cross in the semis and Jim Martin for 3rd and 4th. Also had the loss to Dave Zuniga, which was one I wasn't on my radar. I'm pretty sure it was when he was at Minnesota, not at Utah State, where he started his career. Yep. And he had at least 2 to Alan Freed. One, of course, was the match of legend where Freed insists that he didn't throw a headlock, and he's actually been quoted as such with bleeping. Did not throw a bleeping headlock, I think was his exact quote in such like that. He's even mad at Amateur Wrestling News for having throws a headlock or something in the photo of Amateur Wrestling News from the Midlands. So when we get to Brands, he's got the most losses of actually John Smith has 8, and of those 8, listen, here I actually could track down Smith's losses. So he lost to Kevin Darkus 3 times, tied him once, lost to Jim Jordan twice, and lost to Greg Randall by injury default, and lost to Gil Sanchez the first match of his junior year, and then never lost again. I'm leaving 1 out. I'll get to that in a moment. So right now, we've got a solid 5. But now comes the argument. Go ahead. What do you got, Matt?
Yeah, I was gonna introduce an interesting thought with John that changed the dynamic of his career. And I think you can break John's career down between his first 2 years of college and his last 2 years, because he redshirted in the middle. And that's when you look back and you read about the history, that's when he spent, I believe, 6 months over in Russia. And that's where he really transformed his style. I think when we think of John Smith, we think of the low singles and the high crotches and these type things. And really his style changed dramatically after his loss to Jim Jordan in the national finals, and what he did and how he changed after that. So there's two two different eras in John Smith's college career, and they were broken up by that redshirt year. And that's where the interesting discussion pieces come in. It's like, wait, the wrestler that we knew post his redshirt year was different than the wrestler we knew pre his redshirt years, and how he changed. And after, we have to recognize, after that redshirt year is when he ran off 6 straight world titles as well.
All right, and one thing, the fact, here's where I'm going to go to the whole team here for a second. I'm going to list these names of these 15 on the 75th anniversary team, and what do they have in common? John Smith, Wade Chalice, Kurt Angle, and Carlton Hasselrig. What do they have in common?
John Smith, Kurt Angle, Carlton Hasselrig, and Wade Chalice? I don't know.
They either did not place or did not qualify as a freshman. So in Wade's place, Wade did not place as a freshman. Neither did Kurt Angle. Carlton Hasselrig did not qualify because he was 3rd in Division II as a freshman, which did not give you the opportunity for the Division I championship at that point. So
because you had to actually win to qualify.
I think it was first or second. I think you had again. Pat Pecora had said you had a certain number of bids. It was kind of like it was historical data. D2 got as many bids as they had performed to earn, or how many team points, air quotes, which you would do. So interesting that John Smith is in that boat. John didn't place as a freshman. How many people knew that? I mean, people that go back and do the history do, but John Smith lost to a guy from Cleveland State named Dan Folasy, who has a unique distinction, and they added the top 8 placement in 1979. That's basically kind of like the top 8 starts in 79. Well, Dan is the only, he was the first wrestler. There have been 19 wrestlers to hit that blood round 3 times. He is the first who hit the blood round 3 times and didn't play. So John Smith losing a match to a wrestler who was not an All-American is like the biggest chink in the armor to the John Smith defense in this argument, because if you look at his other losses, okay, fine, yeah, we're going to give you the Kevin Darkus. He was a beast. Jim Jordan was a beast. We look at Brands. Everybody Brands lost to was a beast. You know, Gable, the guy he lost to he lost in the finals. I mean, Abbas lost to Juergens twice, and then Guerrero, and there's another loss. So it's the weakest loss of the 5 in there, which means, does John potentially fall out of this top 5? There's the heresy. There is wrestling blasphemy right there, Matt.
Well, I mean, based upon what we're saying, if we're going strict, based upon our loose, I was about to say strict criteria, but it's
there's no criteria.
We're just talking college. Arguments. We're talking just college, right? And so there's other guys like the guy that jumps off my list that would replace him would be a guy by the name of Mike Caruso from Lehigh, a 3-time national champ. And it's his story that pulls me in, because he was beyond my era. Like, I never got to see Mike wrestle, but once I understood his story and understood the difficulty not only of winning a national championship, but winning 3 straight, what Mike Caruso did, he beat the same guy 3 straight years in the NCAA finals. And anybody, we've talked about it a little bit, beat a guy once, okay, beat him twice, it's even more difficult. That 3rd time to beat that same guy, the high-level guy that he faced from Michigan for a 3rd straight year. I just put myself in the mind of the competitor, and I've had battles like this where I had to beat a guy repeatedly back to back to back. And it's difficult, especially when the motivation on the other side continues to increase. I know the guy that and his name was
Bob Fears.
Bob Fears. Yes. I just reread the article yesterday as we were kind of prepping for this. And, there's this fantastic, this hugely emotional picture. Every time I see it, I get choked up and I get a tear in my eye. It's Mike Caruso, Bob Fears on the award stand after he beat Bob for the 3rd straight time, and they're clutching hands. This guy's distraught. Bob is distraught. He's broken down. He inconsolable. And you have the guy that's beating him, and they're holding hands on the podium. And I just imagine the level of respect, and not the level of respect, but also, the competitive fight that this guy had to have to keep coming back. And in the stories, Bob Fears, Mike was asking Bob, why did you do this? You could have gone up a weight and won this match. You could have won at I think 131 was a weight class maybe at the time. And he said, because I never could have lived with myself. I could have won that weight, but I could never look back and know that I ran away from the challenge and you were the challenge. And to navigate that landscape of beating the guy 3 straight years back to back to back, I think it's fascinating. And I think Russo was, I believe, 53-1 in college. Was that his record? Somewhere around there, right? I believe he lost one time.
Yeah, one time, and it's one loss, and this is where we'll get to it, is now when we're arguing the quality of losses. His loss was to Bob Steenledge from Army, who his best finish was 3rd in 1966. So, there's a loss in the middle there because the fierce Caruso trifecta went 65, 66, and 67 at 123 pounds. That was the weight. So, there's that. So other candidates, I know that the Caruso story, yeah, and you're right. That is one that's actually down in Michigan lore too, because pretty sure that's the only time that's ever happened that somebody's met 3 straight years in the finals. Gray Simons beat Dick Wilson 2 years in a row in the finals, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But here are the other arguments for the pool. Dave Auble of Cornell was a freshman, did not place, and then won 2 titles. Caruso, Dwayne Keller, who in that era from Oklahoma State, part of the Keller twins, well, he was freshman ineligible, 1-1-2. He did the exact same thing that Gable did, got beat in the finals. His senior year was undefeated until he got beat. The story with Keller is he had a child the day of the finals, and then he got majored by Roger Weigel of Oregon State in the finals 15-7, or majored at the time. It's now majored. The scoring wasn't the same then. But, that was Weigel's only national championship. And you go 1-1-2, just like Gable. Nobody talks about Dwayne Keller like they do Dan Gable, because Gable was, of course, undefeated through high school and undefeated during the freshman ineligible year. But to go 1-1-2, undefeated, lose your last match, I don't think enough is talked about Dwayne Keller, to be honest with you, especially now. I know those in Stillwater and those in Oklahoma hold him in very high regard, but that's where I think it's important for, and I'm going to raise my hand here. I'm 40 years old. I'm 40. I'm a man, just to quote another great Oklahoma State man, Mike Gundy. But the history that's in my generation, we don't really know a lot of the stories that were in the Gable era. And this was a year after, I believe it was 71 that Keller got beat in the finals by Roger Weigel. Again, the story that goes around that he was in cars just trying to get back to the tournament. I'm not sure if he was between sessions that the child was born. There's a story out there floating around. It'd be something to look up for sure. But that's a guy that doesn't get talked about in the historical lore of wrestling, going 1-1-2. Gable gets all the 1-1-2. I mean, his lore was grown with the World Championship, the Olympic Championship, and then the 21 Big Ten titles in a row, and all the championships that go with it. But from a wrestling standpoint, the Dwayne Keller story is fascinating to me, just like Mike Caruso is fascinating to you.
Yeah, and I don't know, JB, you and I have both had kids. Does that actually distract you? Could he have been somewhat distracted before that match? I don't know, possibly, if he actually had a kid. Like, I can't believe he actually was able to compete. But yeah, I mean, it's funny coming from Okie State. You would think that would be one of those tales that grows in lore over the years, that, he had whatever the story was, he cut the umbilical cord and they threw him in the cop car and rushed him off to the arena, and he was putting his singlet on while he was running to the mat and all that good stuff. But yeah, you would think, especially knowing the stories that the Okie State guys can tell, that they could really have a really good story about this. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and because it's a similar tale, a similar story to Gable, coming from similarly reputable schools at the time, that there wouldn't be a bigger narrative about this than what we had with the Gable story. And again, I think there was more eyes on Gable just because his high school record, his college record, and that was a storyline that was building from the start of his high school career, where with Keller, maybe that there just wasn't a point of connectivity to add levels to the narrative, levels to the story that made it appealing or attached to the public. Where with Gable, his lore kind of grew. It at every level, it grew bigger and bigger and bigger, from high school to college to coaching to everything that is Gable. Like, he defined it. So it's really hard when you're putting up a vote to have any subjectivity, because how do you segment out what is Dan Gable and what his influence is on the sport? Like, how are you truly supposed to separate that when you hit click on the vote?
Yeah, it's definitely. I'm sure I can't remember the online ballot, because what would be cool now is if we were to do something like this, we could have a discourse about each one of these guys, and that would make it that much more engaging. Now we get to Randy Lewis, who was in the 4-year era, 2-1-1-7, and the 7 is unfortunately what might disqualify with the credentials, because we all know the story is Randy dislocated his elbow wrestling Jim Gibbons from Iowa State, and oddly enough, those two are really, really close friends today. You see them at nationals together all the time. But a 2-1-1-7, you get another 2-time champion, and that likely derailed a 3-time career, because Lubu was lights out, fun to watch. If you can find any of his old footage, I mean, just even though it's freestyle, the Olympics in '84 was just putting up buckets and buckets of points. I mean, Lubu's a guy that if he's got a 3rd title, no question, he's on this list no matter what.
Well, when you think about Randy Lewis, I think a lot of people, when they think about the untouchable leg, they think that applies to Kerry Colat with his spaghetti leg and his loose knee. But the original untouchable leg was Randy Lewis. Like, there's stories of him like just baiting guys, like, take my leg. I dare you. I dare you to score with me. And I think that's, again, when you leave this up to the fans, like, everybody knows, like, Randy Lewis is this somewhat mythical figure in wrestling to a certain extent. His legend has grown. There was a legend during his career, and it just grew after. Like, the stories became almost fables that were passed on to generations of wrestlers. And we hear stories about all that Iowa era with, from Randy Lewis, Royce Alger, Rico Chiapparelli. I mean, there's stories about all of these guys that continue to grow when you're talking about the Gable era and, their successive title streaks and everything they won. Like, I think it's hard for fans to separate that, but I think, yes, we know the backstory. We know his elbow was dislocated, but that's all also a testament to the guys that were able to make the finals and win it 3 times. They were able to navigate the landscape and the pitfalls of wrestling without getting dinged with a major injury, because that's always one of the biggest things. I mean, look at Spencer Lee's career. We're going to look back possibly in 20 years and like, this guy should have been a 4-timer. And people were like, well, you can't dictate circumstance. You can't dictate injury. So, I mean, for me, as much as I loved watching Randy Lewis and he was so entertaining, I mean, it kind of disqualifies him, at least in my view, from the list.
Yeah,
even though it was outside of his control.
Yeah, and it kind of gives you when we talk about injuries again, that makes what Cale did in 4 years undefeated not a rolled ankle, just that makes it that much more impressive. Next guy is one of the most dominant pinners of wrestling, like entirety. Like when you go back to thinking about what the foundations of wrestling is and catch can and things like that is to pin your opponent or make him give a Gene Mills. As beastly as he was 3-4-1-1, and there are 141 2-time national champions. This guy's near the top of that list, but again, we're looking at 2-timers when we've still got guys like Ed Peary and Myron Roderick, even though in their old time days, they're still 3-timers in 3-year 3-year opportunities. So as much as we liked Mean Gene, I think those 3-4 before you get to the 2 titles might have to just say, hey, we will still always have the Gene Mills versus Wade Schaus argument about who Division I's best pinner was, because when one finds a fall, the other one seems to find another one, and back and forth as they stand at 107 and 106. But Mean Gene, definitely a fun guy to talk wrestling, and definitely one of the greats. But again, the 3-4-1-1, if you're looking at just the stats, is one thing that'll keep him from breaking into that top 5.
Yeah, Mean Gene is one of my favorite guys looking back. I mean, he's one of those guys. I mean, I had a poem written down in my basement every day when I went down to lift as a kid and growing through high school. I had a poem that he wrote, staring me at the face. He's a guy that inspired me, and just not only the way he wrestled, the dominant way, but was there a bigger patriot for our country in the day, in the era, everything that he was going through in the Cold War? Was there a better patriot was vocal about his love for our country than Mean Gene. But unfortunately, in the context of this conversation, the narrative doesn't even make it out of the gates, because he's quite, I'm with you. His 3 and 4 out of the gates kind of stops the discussion before it actually starts, unfortunately.
Listen to us. You at least wrestled there. I never was, and we're sitting here talking about. Sorry, Gene, you're not in the top 5.
It now seems callous, like, geez.
Yeah. Moving to Rex Peary, who was 29-0, and this is again where we get into the limitations of the eras at the time, and we're looking at one of the great wrestling families of all time. I mean, the Pearys are just it's amazing to know Hugh, Ed, and Rex. I mean, they're in the Hall of Fame. I mean, we're talking 1933, 1934, 1935. I mean, we really have zero, except for maybe the writings of Bob Dellinger and then Mike Chapman, who, the late Bob Dellinger, the Dellinger Award is named after him. And Chapman has written about the guys like Jack Van Beber from the 30s, the 20s and 30s, about being, mans and just brutal type of wrestlers back in the day. But it's really hard because I have nothing really on the Pearys here, because other than their stats, 29-0 Rex, and then Ed 51-1, the loss apparently coming sometime his junior year. And then we got Myron Roderick, who was, a big time leader in the sport, longtime coach at Oklahoma State, 28-2, and went freshman 1-1-1. So that group right there, I think it's just really hard to get a grasp on. I think, Ed is the more recent of the three of that trio there. So, I mean, again, I speak from ignorance here. I have no idea really even how to balance these guys, other than maybe when we look at teams, we may have to come up with a situation to honor those wrestlers from the 20s and 30s and 40s pre-World War II in a way that's in line with the competition days of the era, and something that, because wrestlers back then and it's really hard to compare. I mean, the rule sets are different. The styles of wrestling different. The scoring's different. I mean, there was a time advantage thing. Some matches went on for a long time. They were actually in rings. There were ropes. I mean, it was just different. I mean, the national championships one year were at West Gym and what was then Iowa Teachers College. I mean, there's so many different things to the eras that make this hard to do, especially, looking back 15 years ago when they were making the distinction. But again, I have to draw a blank on those three.
Yeah, I mean, really, I know something about all these people, and I was fortunate enough to meet Myron on a number of occasions and talk about one of the great characters in wrestling. Like, this guy was unbelievable. Even when I met him in his 70s, like the stories, like I understand why you were a great wrestler and a great recruiter just on the stories he would tell. But unfortunately, with a lot of these guys, there's not many historians like yourself, JB, that have really kept us current and engaged on what was going on. And unfortunately for a lot of these guys, the body of work just isn't there, right? I mean, when you're limited to 30 less matches, 40 less matches, I mean, and then what we know about the competition, we just don't know enough. So I guess I would say shame on us for we see the obvious dominance of these three athletes and what they did, but shame on us for not having the knowledge about it. So,
I mean, Rex Peary, Oklahoma A&M at the time is 1-1-1. John Smith wasn't 1-1-1. Undefeated. John Smith wasn't undefeated. But again, the argument there is who's the top 5 at Oklahoma State in college credentials. So, I mean, that's I'd love to see the discussions that those guys had back then. But and the last official one that was on the list was Rick Sanders at Portland State, who, the legend of Rick Sanders is what it is. I mean, it's like grown with age. Those who know stories about him. I mean, he was passed long before I was even on this earth. And, just his legendary funk and his more of a hippie, I guess, lifestyle is how it's been described. The beard, the hitchhiking, the, Oregon, it's just what it is back then. And what's interesting, and when I was researching Rick Sanders, is he was freshman ineligible, 1-1-2, but he was at Portland State, which at the time was also in the college division. Now, it was an open university, which was Division I. There was no Division I label until the early 70s, but the university championship, he was freshman eligible 1-1-2. The college division, which you could again then go to the university division following, he was freshman eligible, third first. So the year he won the university division, he was third in what is now commonly referred to as Division II, but he was third at 123 pounds, losing in the semis to Warren Crow of Albany. Crow would finish fourth at the university division at 123. What does Rick Sanders win the university division at? He drops to 115. So he wrestled at a higher weight at the university. That obviously wouldn't happen in today's weight. But does that almost say, oh, well, you didn't win the university division at this weight class, then you drop down and then win that? So how do you determine that? I mean, he did pin Tadaki Hata in the semifinals that year. And if those of you know, wrestling out in the country, especially out in Ohio, Tadaki's just the man. But Rick Sanders is his lore. Does his lore get him on the docket or the ballot, so to speak? Because you didn't win the university division. Okay.
And I think the lore of Sanders is almost, in my mind, like Prefontaine-ish. Right?
I was gonna say that, but I'm not. Let's be honest. I'm not a runner. I don't know the running culture. And I know a little bit about, Steve Prefontaine, but I can't speak on that with any authority that's kind of walked around it. So I'll defer to you, but I know that there's a legend about him.
Yeah. I mean, this was a guy that set high school records in college that still stand. I believe up until recently, he still held the national high school record in 2 miles, Steve Prefontaine, but he went on to smash every NCAA record, owned, I think, the majority of NCAA titles from anywhere from the mile up to 10,000 meters, dominated everything, had just a swagger about him, a confidence about him, took on the AAU when he was competing internationally. So he had this mythical aura, and then he obviously died tragically, I believe in 1974, 75, as he was just resuming his training for the 76 games. So Rick Sanders takes a similar personality when you have this larger than life personality that everybody latches onto, and then you have a wrestling style that transcends normal means. He was the Ben Askren of his era, the Ben Askren preceding Ben by 40 years, and with a style and a personality. And then he similarly died early, as did Prefontaine, before he really got into his prime and could have won multiple Olympic and world titles. So yeah, I think naturally when a talent's life is taken too early and we see the obvious talents and what could have been, obviously we project that out and that adds to his legacy in a different way. But in the context of this argument, unfortunately, I would say losing at the college division, college division kind of is probably a disqualifier. Like, because in these situations, you have to make tough calls. And just like we said with Randy Lewis, hey, he can't control his injury, but injury factors into the decision. He lost at the college division. So that's a disqualifier for me.
And his title was, again, he dropped a weight, whereas the guy that beat him in the semifinals, which I looked up, I think was 19-12, was that semifinal against Warren Crow from Albany. And so, and he finished fourth. So where does he finish at 123, the weight he was at the college division? So in today's way, he couldn't go back down. So again, that to me is always a fun discussion, looking at what was available to do back in the day. Now, this guy is the 16th guy we're going to talk about, not on the list, which is probably was the most irksome for me. So in 2005, I'm a year graduated from ODU. Gray Simons was the head coach at Old Dominion during my entire time. He spent 17 years there. He was a Norfolk native, coached at Indiana State, Lock Haven, Tennessee, finished up at Old Dominion. Then Steve Martin got the job after Gray retired. Now with Gray, he was only a one-time high school state champ as a sophomore from legendary Granby, coached by Billy Martin, inventor of the Granby roll. Gray went to Lock Haven, and at the time, schools that had under 800 students allowed freshmen to compete, and they were a dual affiliate of the NCAA and the NAIA. Well, at the time, the NAIA, you could wrestle as a freshman. So Gray Simons would win 4 NAIA national championships in 59, 60, 61, and 62. This is also, again, dual affiliate. It was not a qualifier. So he had 3 years at the Division I champion or the university championships, champion. 7 titles. I believe he was OW 6 times. Not on the ballot. Career record officially 89-1. That one loss to Paul Powell, the NCAA champion from Pitt, up a weight. Gray was a 115-pounder. So his one loss ever on the books. There was a open loss to a coach from Syracuse, which, full disclosure, I've got to mention because for a while that was on his record. I'm not sure how it got wiped away. I don't know if Jay Hammond wiped that away, but that was an assistant coach from Syracuse, which in today's era wouldn't count. But of course, Lee Kemp also has a loss in his era to a post-collegian, which did count for some reason. I don't know. I don't make the rules, but the point is that Gray's official record is listed at 89-1, and that one loss was to the NCAA champion at a higher weight class. So we look at the first wrestler in NAIA history to win 4 national titles. We look at one of the, let's see, how many 3-time champs do we have? According to this, we have 48 3-time champions. He eventually went on to win or wrestle on 2 Olympic teams too. Again, that's adding to it. But again, there's one collegiate loss, and it was to a guy above at a higher weight class that was an NCAA champ, and no other losses. And Dick beats Dick Wilson of Toledo twice, who's a distinguished member of the Hall of Fame. Like, I'm looking at 89-1 of losses of freshman to the national champ the year above. And why wasn't this guy even on the bracket? Like, why wasn't this guy even on the ballot? Gray farts more wrestling knowledge than I'll ever know. And he's still kicking around. He's 80 years old. And he's riding his bike and doing all sorts of stuff down at Virginia Beach. But this is the one that pissed me off about this list more than anything else, is because the greatness of a guy like Gray Simons, who never really talked about himself as a coach, which may have been somewhat of a shortcoming on the bench because, when you're a 2-time Olympian and 3-time national champion, 7-time national champ, the only guy that's done it, Hasselrig's got 6 titles, 3 Division II, 3 Division I. Gray's got 7. Now, it was an early era of the NAIA. So there is my question is, why wasn't Gray Simons even on the ballot? And yes, I will put him in my top 5. Completely biased because even though I didn't wrestle in college, Gray was my college coach. And that's how I kind of describe it. Because I was in the room, I'd sit there and talk. He told me stories about Doug Bluebaugh. He told me all these stories about wrestling these guys in the great. He talked about Dick Wilson and wrestling in the Army and Rome and it just... To leave a guy like Gray off the ballot annoyed me, but he's, to me, a surefire top 5 on this list.
How do you say
completely biased?
What do you say in these to introduce mic drop here? Like, that's a mic drop.
I would mic drop it, but this is a $500 microphone, and I don't really want to do. Actually, it's okay, $399. But anyway,
so when we're breaking this down, JB, and the only logical thing, because this, talk about a complete, disrespectful, like that he wasn't even nominated. He wasn't even on the
top 15 of that list.
That's unbelievable. So. The only thing, JB, that I can possibly think why that was a situation is when we introduced this ballot in 2005, I think the perception of what NAIA is on a competitive level in relation to D1 in 2005 was much different than the reality of the competitive level of the NAIA when Gray competed. I mean,
part of that too is this is also an NCAA list. And while the NCAA doesn't, I'll say this, they don't ignore the NAIA, but they are for lack of a better term, they are a competing organization. Do you promote another organization's 4-time champion as part of your NCAA list? Now, that's one thing I was thinking about, but I want to look back up something real quick from the NAIA standpoint. So in that era, the NAIA championship history. So listen to some of the schools that were in the NAIA and that were champions at the time. So Minnesota State, which is now Minnesota State Mankato, Bloomsburg, Lock Haven, Minnesota State Moorhead, Adams State, Nebraska Omaha, Central Washington, a lot of these schools, Central Oklahoma. So up until the 80s, a lot of these schools then reclassified to NCAA Division II, like, where you've got your now Adams State, Central Oklahoma, Simon Fraser Division II. But back in the 60s, it was the Pennsylvania State Athletic Conference. So it was the same stuff they were qualifying to wrestle. They may not, Clarion, for example, wasn't in a situation where they were NAI. I think they might have been NAI for 1 year, but it was a dual affiliation. It wasn't like you're one or the other like it is now. So that's the one thing that I'm sitting there looking at going, okay, that may be one thing, but from an NCAA standpoint, okay, I have 1 loss and I have 3 national titles.
Right there, you put them in the mix, and then you add. I mean, that's the thing. What we do for one, we can't do for another. because look at Carlton Hasselrig. Why is he on the list? His 6th title, 6, right? His 6. That's the lore of Carlton Hasselrig. So why wouldn't we apply the same argument to Gray Simons? He's got 7. And in my opinion, the NAIA title supersedes a D2 title in which Carlton Hasselrig is given credit for. I think we look at Carlton.
Well, he was third, and Carlton was third. We'll get to the heavyweights, of course, later. But as a comparative point, he was third in Division II as a freshman.
Right.
Which, again, that's the 6 titles talked about. Well, look at the totality of the career. And, Hasselrig, for example, I'm going to jump ahead here. He stays on the list. He stays on his side.
Without a doubt. But what he did, he validated. You can't discredit his D2 titles because he validated it by also winning the D1 title. And case in point, Gray, the same logic should apply to Gray. You can't discount his NAIA titles because he validated them on the championship level.
So as we look up Gray here just for a minute, I'm looking at the years. So his seeds those years were 2, 1, and 1. So it wasn't like he was an unseeded guy coming from this little division and beating people. So it's one of those things. So I'm going to say that's my piece. And here's what my ultimate final point on this, Matt, is I put Gray Simons in that top 5, and I put him. Where do I put him though? Because this means I bumped John Smith out. I bumped the GOAT out. Ultimately, it was the loss to Dan Foldesy that's the determining factor here. But where do I put him on the list behind it with Utaki, Gable, Abbas, Brands, and Smith? Well, again, being completely biased here, I'm putting him in that. It's hard for me to argue. I mean, Gable was 1-1-2. Gray was 1-1-1.
He never lost in the finals match.
I'd put him number 2 on my list, and that is probably going to be the second most earth-shattering thing you hear about Old Dominion here in the near future.
Well, let's hope that's not the case, JB. But yes, I have to agree with you, because what did I say at the beginning? My qualifying standards usually are based on titles. When I think about Michael Jordan and every other argument, he's the GOAT because he's got 6. So titles for me own the day. So I am with you. I would probably, based upon what we know about Utaki, I would put him 1 because he's the rule changer. He changed the rules of the game, which I think that's the totally boss thing. Like that supersedes his NCAA titles. When you change the rules of the game, that elevates your credibility. So I would put him 1. I would put Gray 2. I would put Gable 3. I would probably put Brands 4 and Abbas 5.
I'm not going to argue either way there, because they're both, 4-1-1-1. And, this whole thing has been picking nits. So, but again, I mean, Abbas has fewer losses collegiately, and then one of his 4 losses, he did bump up and lost to a 3-time champion. So that's, I think, keeping that thing. I would probably put Abbas slightly ahead of Brands. But again, I also grew up in an era watching Stephen Abbas. So I don't want to say wrestling 20 years ago is recency bias, but I had eyes on Stephen Abbas, and he won his last national title my first year. We talked about last episode in 2002. So I got to see this guy in his prime. So it's one thing it's like when people watch Gable in his prime, they remember that, or they remember the Branch just mauling people. They remember McElravy mauling Jerry Abbas. Those are things that stick out in your mind. And watching Stephen Abbas wrestle for the first time will always stick out in my mind. And yes, like you've got John Smith bias, I do have Gray Simons bias, and I have Stephen Abbas bias unapologetically.
Yes, and I can't argue with that, because you are influenced by your era, who you physically see, and when you're competing at the same time. Like I grew up in the era, Brands is a little older than me, but he is a guy. Like, he changed how wrestling was wrestled, much in the same way we look at Metcalf and his influence on the 2000s and later 2000s, right? I mean, there are people that move the needle and change the way wrestling is wrestled. And those are 2 guys. Steven did the same thing in early 2000s, the way he attacked, the way, he was like the 2.0 version, I would say, of John Smith. He was maybe one of those first guys. There was a lot of guys in the 90s that tried to emulate or replicate certain things that John did. I think Steven was a guy that was influenced by John, but he put his own flavor on it and put his own stamp on it. No, we weren't looking at a mirror of John Smith. We were looking at an extension and an elevation of what John did.
Why don't we just end on that? Because tail's gonna be tucked between my legs when it comes to John W. He got a picture of him. I got a signed poster of him on my wall. I hold him in high regard. But that ends the first part of our series on this. Next episode, we are going to look at the middleweights, 142 to 172. Here's who made it: Lee Kemp, Lincoln McElravy, Wade Shallis, Pat Smith, Joe Williams. Who was on the ballot? Maybe who should be on that team? That'll be next time. So for Matt Dernlan, I'm Jason Bryant. This has been the RUDIS Wrestling Podcast.